Hey everyone, excited to jump into a topic that I think you're going to find super interesting today, debt for nature swaps. It's a little bit like finding a hidden treasure in a stack of, well, let's just say not so thrilling financial documents. But for those of you who love digging into how countries can actually make deals to protect the environment, this deep dive is going to be right up your alley. So we're going to unpack what these swaps are all about, a little bit of the history behind them, and then dive into some of the benefits and drawbacks. So first things first. What exactly is a debt for nature swap? Imagine this. A country owes a bunch of money, but instead of paying it back in cash, they say, hey, how about we protect this massive rainforest instead?
Hmm.
It's like paying a bill with environmental action, which is a pretty cool concept, right? And you might be surprised to learn that this idea has been around for longer than you might think.
That's right. This whole concept was actually born back in 1987, the brainchild of Thomas Lovejoy from the World Wildlife Fund. He realized there was this opportunity to tackle two major issues at once: the huge amount of debt that a lot of developing nations were struggling with, and the urgent need to protect the environment, especially in these biologically diverse areas.
1987. That feels like both a lifetime ago, AD, just yesterday, when I think about how much the world has changed since then, especially when it comes to understanding the need to protect our planet.
Absolutely. And that very first swap, which involved Conservation International and Bolivia, really proved that this idea could work.
Hmm.
And get this, since then, debt for nature swaps have actually helped channel over $1 billion towards conservation efforts and some of the most incredible ecosystems on Earth.
Okay, now that's what I call putting your money where your mouth is. But how does this actually work in the real world? I mean, it can't just be a promise to plant a few trees and call it even, right?
No, it's definitely more involved than that. If you take a look at Figure 1 from the Wikipedia article, it gives you a helpful visual breakdown. Basically, you've got the debtor country, the one that owes the money.
Yeah.
Then you've got the creditor, who could be another country or even a bank. And here's where it gets really interesting. A third party often steps in, typically a non-governmental organization or NGO.
Right, because they're all about the environmental protection side of things.
Exactly. So let's say this NGO really wants to help protect a rainforest in the debtor country. They approach the creditor and basically offer to buy the debt, but at a lower price. Because let's face it, these loans can be pretty risky, so the creditor might be happy to get something rather than potentially nothing at all.
So it's like a win for the creditor, and I'm guessing the NGO has a plan for what they want to do.
You bet they do. They turn to the debtor country and say, look, we've taken on this debt for you, but instead of paying us back in cash, why not invest that money in this specific conservation project? So essentially, the debt is being repaid, but through environmental action rather than direct financial payments. Pretty clever.
That is seriously impressive. But something tells me it's not always just one rainforest, one debt swap. There have to be other ways to structure these deals, right?
You're spot on. Debt for nature swaps aren't a one-size-fits-all solution. We've been talking about this third-party scenario, officially called a commercial debt for nature swap. But there's a whole other category called bilateral or multilateral swaps, which involve different players and financial arrangements, and we'll get into those next.
So there's a whole other flavor to these debt for nature deals, it sounds like.
Exactly. We've been focusing on those commercial swaps with the NGO as the intermediary, but let's dive into those bilateral and multilateral ones you mentioned.
Okay, so bilateral, my brain immediately goes to like two countries making a deal directly. Is that about right?
Yeah, you got it. It's basically two countries striking a bargain. One agrees to forgive, or at least reduce, a big chunk of debt.
Right.
And in exchange, the country that owed the money, they promise to use those funds for, you guessed it, environmental protection projects.
So in this case, there's no NGO swooping in to buy up debt at a discount.
Not necessarily. NGOs might still be involved on the ground running the actual conservation projects, but when it comes to the money side of things, it's a direct agreement between the two governments, no middleman.
Gotcha. And I'm assuming multilateral just means more countries get in on the action, right? Like a whole team huddle to sort out a debt swap.
You're catching on quick. Picture this. You've got a group of lender countries, and they come together and say to a debtor nation, listen, we're willing to lighten your debt load a bit, but in return, you got to promise to hit these specific environmental targets we've all agreed on.
So it's like a team effort for both debt relief and conservation. Kind of a cool concept when you think about it.
It really is.
Yeah.
And a great real-world example of these bilateral swaps in action is the agreement between the United States and Jamaica back in the early 90s. The U.S. agreed to forgive a portion of Jamaica's debt, and instead of sending those loan payments back to the U.S., Jamaica used that money to establish their own environmental foundation. Pretty forward-thinking, right?
It's like taking money that would have been spent paying off old debts and reinvesting it in a greener future. I mean, that's got to be a win-win situation for everyone involved, wouldn't you say?
It certainly has the potential to be.
Mm.
And it brings up a really important point about these debt-for-nature swaps.
Yeah.
Who actually benefits? We've touched on it a bit, but it's worth digging a little deeper into who gets what out of these deals.
Yeah, because from the debtor country's perspective, it seems like a bit of a no-brainer. I mean, they get some much-needed debt relief. Plus, they get to improve their environment in the process. Sounds pretty good to me.
It can be a game changer for them, for sure. But it's not just about the immediate debt relief, although that's obviously huge. It can also lead to more favorable loan terms in the future, because they're seen as taking positive steps. And then there's the long-term economic benefits that investing in conservation can bring.
It's like how Costa Rica has become this major ecotourism destination because they've made a point of protecting their rainforests and their natural beauty.
Exactly. And on top of that, there are the benefits that you can't really put a price tag on. Preserving biodiversity, safeguarding those vital ecosystems, even playing a role in combating climate change. These are all incredibly valuable outcomes.
Absolutely. So it sounds like there are a ton of potential benefits for the debtor countries, but what's in it for the creditors? Why would they agree to essentially give up money that's owed to them? It seems a bit counterintuitive.
Well, it's important to remember that these loans aren't always seen as a sure thing. Sometimes, for the lender, accepting a smaller return, even if it's not the full amount, is a safer bet than risking a situation where they might not get anything back at all, especially with countries facing economic difficulties.
So it's kind of like cutting their losses, maybe gaining some goodwill in the process too.
Precisely. Plus, it can be a strategic move for creditor countries to kind of further their own foreign policy goals or even boost their image on the world stage. Donated towards conservation efforts, well, that generally tends to make countries look pretty good.
Right. It's not always purely altruistic. There's some smart strategy involved too. But we can't forget about that third group we talked about, the conservation organizations themselves. They're reaping some benefits from these deals as well, right?
Well, absolutely. For NGOs, it often comes down to securing long-term dedicated funding for their projects. Remember how we talked about that first swap in Bolivia, helping unlock over $1 billion for conservation? These swaps give these organizations the resources they need to make a real, lasting impact on the ground.
It's like they're acting as this bridge, connecting the world of finance with these urgent environmental needs, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. But here's the thing. If it's also beneficial, why aren't debt-for-nature swaps more common? I mean, they seem like a great idea. Are there drawbacks or challenges that we haven't talked about yet? Because it seems like there's always another side to every story.
You're right. There are always different perspectives and potential downsides to consider.
Yeah.
While debt-for-nature swaps have this incredible potential, it's really important to remember that they're not some kind of magic solution, and there's been some valid criticisms and potential downsides that we should unpack.
All right, let's talk about the elephant in the room here. We've been focusing on the positives, the win-wins, but it sounds like there's another side to this story, some valid concerns about whether these swaps are all they're cracked up to be.
That's right. It's important to remember that they're not a magic bullet. One of the biggest criticisms you'll hear is that the actual amount of debt relief, well, that can be pretty small, especially when you think about the massive debt burdens some of these countries are dealing with. We're talking billions, sometimes trillions of dollars. And a debt-for-nature swap might only address a tiny fraction of that.
So it's more like a step in the right direction, not necessarily a giant leap forward.
That's one way to put it. And then there's the issue of, oversight and accountability. Just because money is supposed to be going towards conservation, it doesn't automatically guarantee that it's being used in the most efficient or effective way.
Right. You need to make sure it's actually making a difference where it's needed most.
Exactly. There have been legitimate questions raised about whether the funds always target the most urgent environmental issues, or if there's a risk of mismanagement, corruption even. These are real concerns.
And even if the money is managed perfectly, it's not like debt relief alone magically solves all these complex environmental problems, right?
You're hitting on a crucial point. These issues, deforestation, pollution, biodiversity loss, they often stem from these deeply rooted social, economic, even political factors. It's not enough to just throw money at the problem. You need to address the underlying causes, too.
It's like putting a bandage on a broken bone, right? It might help a little, but it's not a long-term fix.
I like that analogy. And that actually brings up another big concern, the whole issue of long-term sustainability. You get this initial influx of cash from the debt swap, which is great, but what happens a few years down the line when that money runs out?
Can those local communities, those organizations on the ground, can they keep those conservation projects going?
That's the million-dollar question. And it really highlights how important it is to build local capacity, making sure those communities are truly invested, that they have the skills, the resources to manage these projects for the long haul. That's crucial for success.
So it's about more than just money. It's about empowering those communities to become stewards of their own environment.
100%.
Right.
And that leads us to another really important consideration that often comes up, the impact on local and indigenous communities. We're talking about protecting their land, their resources, their way of life, so their voices absolutely need to be heard.
Their perspective is essential, not just from an ethical standpoint, but also to make sure that these conservation efforts are actually beneficial in the long run.
Right. It can't be a top-down approach. Their involvement, their knowledge, their consent, these aren't just boxes to tick. They're fundamental to making sure these projects work for everyone.
It's been really eye-opening to dig into this with you. I think we went in thinking this was a pretty simple idea, debt for nature, what's not to love. But as we've seen, it's crucial to be aware of the complexities, the potential downsides, to make sure these swaps are living up to their promise.
Absolutely. And to keep asking those tough questions.
Yeah.
Are they being implemented fairly, transparently, and are they truly benefiting both the environment and the people who depend on it?
Those are definitely questions worth considering. So for everyone listening, as you learn more about debt for nature swaps, and we encourage you to do so, keep in mind that while they hold a lot of promise, they're not a silver bullet. It's a balancing act. And finding that balance between protecting our planet and making sure those efforts are equitable and sustainable, that's the key to making a real difference. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and let's keep learning together.